So, what do you think is wrong with this picture?
That part?
This bit here?
Yeah.
Yeah. That white stuff is definitely not normal, but let's take a closer look. Actually, let's start at the top and work backwards. So as we work our way down, skull, brain, you can see that there's not a lot of CSF space. What is in that CSF space that should be black?
Black.
Blood, because it's white. And then more blood, so following the sulci, the blood goes into the sulci, which makes it what kind of hemorrhage?
Intra.
So you've got extradural, subdural, or subarachnoid?
Subarachnoid.
Subarachnoid goes down into the folds, yeah. So as we get further down, you can actually start to see the curve of the midline and blood into there. So the subarachnoid blood is blood that's crossed the arachnoid space, usually arterial hemorrhaging, and at arterial pressure, which creates the pressure issue. As we get further down, you'll start to see white stuff inside the brain. So this is a special kind of subarachnoid blood, which is intraparenchymal blood. And then the volume of blood and the edema around it is space occupying, which starts pushing the brain across the other way, creating a significant midline shift. So sizable bleed, sizable midline shift. So lots of blood, edema around the blood. You might see words like vasogenic. The way I think about that is blood has normally not met brain because you have a
Blood-brain barrier.
Blood-brain barrier. So what does blood do when it meets something it hasn't met before?
It reacts.
Reacts. And that reaction can be seen in the edema. The inflammation, yeah. The inflammation leads to leaky epithelium and water crossing over. So water is darker. You've seen the ventricles here. That's the shape of water. That's the color of air. That's the color of bone. And blood is thicker than water, so much whiter. If we look at that in other cross sections, do we have midline? It's always a good one to see, well, how much blood from front to back. But as we get to the midline, you see some important things. There's the middle. So about there, kind of just try and find the middle of the nose and the middle of the pituitary fossa. And then that, give or take, should be about the middle of the brain. And what we've got is the cerebellum, and it's starting to squeeze out south. The pons is pushing against bone. So there should be a gap between the pons and the sphenoid, which is where what artery lives? Nope. Artery. That's with a B.
Oh, basilar artery.
Basilar artery lives here. So if the pons is getting squashed against bone, it's going to squash the basilar artery, which is its own blood supply. So the problem is brain getting pushed sideways and brain getting pushed down. So if the primary problem is the bleed, the secondary problem is the pressure effects. And what is a high intracranial pressure going to do? By decreasing what? So think about the equation. MAP minus intracranial pressure minus jugular venous pressure is cerebral perfusion pressure. So if you've got less perfusion pressure, what is perfusion? Simply? Oxygen delivery. So if you have less perfusion, do you have less oxygen delivery?
Yeah.
And so think about perfusion as two things. Perfusion pressure, in this instance we're talking pressure, and perfusion flow. Yeah. So if you have a reduced cardiac output, you're going to have less oxygen delivery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or if you just had less hemoglobin, does that sound like less oxygen delivery?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is too much squashy. So the solution to this space occupying problem is, well, what do you think they're going to do?
Drain.
Well, partly, but first, let's find the cause. So, all things being equal, fix the primary problem. Any thoughts as to where you think the problem might be? No, that's just where it does loops through the sphenoid here, I reckon. See, this looks wider than it should be. But let's look closely at what they actually did. There you go.
Mm.
Coiled the aneurysm, which was the problem. So the blood doesn't go in there anymore, and then it seals itself off. So fix the primary problem, yeah, the bleed, to stop more blood happening. What's the secondary problem? Issues of perfusion pressure. So what's going to create a problem of perfusion? Too much intracranial pressure. Why do we have too much intracranial pressure in this instance? There's the coil within where the aneurysm was, and you can see that that's within this big section of blood. That's where it bled from. So what is the cause of the high pressure? The
Bleed.
Bleed is the primary problem, and then the secondary problem is the
Swelling.
edema around that. Yeah. So in this instance, because it's all within a fixed space, the more stuff you have within a fixed space, the more pressure it exerts. So what was the solution to their problems? Well, fix the fixed space issue. Let's go to this one. Now we have, around the same area, we had bone all the way around, and now we have craniectomy. And do they look like they've evacuated some of this hematoma? Yeah, so there's less blood to some degree. Yeah, partly, but it's very hard to get at sometimes. The stuff in the Sylvan fissure you can get at, but this is in the brain. You can see how much the, and find the equivalent level, it's about there somewhere. See the blood and the edema and how much more edema is around that as the edema evolves across time. But if we go to about the same level, give or take, there, the midline shift is a lot better. Which if we just draw from, yeah, we can see more of the ventricles. I have no idea where the midline is at the back there, but probably about there somewhere. Yeah, the midline shift is resolved when the brain has moved back in that direction because it's not pushing against anything anymore. So the pressure was pushing that way, which pushed the brain that way. Now it can push that way as much as it wants and just expand outwards. So it's no longer a fixed space. So do we have issues of intracranial pressure? No. So the mean arterial pressure will drive blood flow and perfusion. The problem becomes, what is the long-term effect on the brain? So we have 16th and then 19th, and then the next one we have is, I just want to go to more recent. Oh, indeed. So the bleeding has largely resolved and disappeared, but the edema itself has gotten more pronounced to some degree. Brain bulging out in that direction. So the edema in here has worsened across time because the actual bleed and pressure has probably infarcted a significant mid-cerebral artery territory.
Yeah.
So what we have here is grey-white differentiation on this side, and then loss of grey-white differentiation on that side to some degree. We had no folds, some folds, and now more folds to some degree on the other side. But then we have brain that's very much less dense than it should be because there's more water there, more inflammation, likely dead brain cells, but you can't see that here. That is the evolution across time. Yeah. Still some blood in there. That's where they've now done a more intervention, I guess, on the aneurysm. I don't know if there's an EVD in there. There isn't one in there now. I don't know if there was one here. I don't see one on this. No EVD. Straight to craniectomy. Is the purpose of the EVD? What kind of fluid? CSF. Which stands for? cerebrospinal fluid. And we have that one. When's that? 19th. What was the midline? Actually, it was the midline, the first instance. Which is there. About there is comparable mid-pituitary fossa, cerebellum, fourth ventricle, pons, and no space in front of the pons. And now we have more CSF space around the pons. Cerebellum doesn't look like it's pushing out through the foramen magnum as much, and so there's less pressure squeezing this section of brain. Make sense? So, problem: brain pushing sideways and brain pushing south, and a pressure problem. And the basilar artery lives there.
Because the basilar artery was getting restricted.
Well, it was just, it's there. If you squash it for hard enough or long enough,
Would it cause a further infarct?
Yeah, so what's the basilar artery supplying? And what's the pons important for?
Everything.
Airway and breathing and circulation. So airway protection is the glossal reflexes. Breathing is the chemoreceptors for. What do we want to respond to in terms of chemicals? CO2 and?
O2.
Yeah, and all the other things, pH. So this is where all your drives breathe. And then that talks down to 3, 4, 5 to your diaphragm and say breathe more. Yeah. So if you forget to breathe, that's the problem. If you don't protect your airway, well, that's a bigger problem. Yeah, but you can see an endotracheal tube here. So airwayed, airway protected with an endotracheal tube. And so, yeah, if you squash that for long enough, you'll infarct the pons. There's not much recovering from that if it's dead enough. Cool. Ready.